Jeremy, how are you?
It is perhaps fitting that the very last session of a week-long conference, we are unable to bring up our ultimate speaker's video feed and audio feed. We like you said, he's been on the site. He's on the site. We've asked him perhaps to jump in on the discussion board. We've tried everything. Nothing is working to get his audio and video feed. Sorry, like I said, I guess it's a bridge too far, if you will. We just tried to squeeze in one too many doggone speakers in this La Jolla conference. I'm always guilty of that. So, look, why don't we, Duncan, you and I have a chat? People can pose questions. Let's just make this. It doesn't necessarily have to be changing the conversation. That's our idea. Hopefully, Carlos will be able to jump on the chat and put a couple comments. Let's do a conversation, Duncan, Martin and Wood, and with the Regules via chat discussion. Let's talk. So, what do you think about these questions? Let me ask you, and then, we've talked about the change in habits. We've talked about the struggle between the government and CFE in the SENACE order and all of these things with regards to the incorporation of clean energy. Using COVID-19 as, let's just call it what it is, a cover to do what rhetorically they've always said they wanted to do. So I'm getting ahead of myself, but let's talk about the habits first. I mean, what have you done? You run the Mexico Institute at the Wilson Center. What have you and your colleagues at the Wilson Center done the last 2 months in terms of, your commuting, your consumption of energy, your ferocious travel schedules and these kinds of things? I'm very interested to see and how has it affected you and how do you see it going forward?
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. So I'm looking at the discussion on the side here, and we've got. I just wanted to give a shout out to Enrique, who I guess he's in Buenos Aires, right? Enrique, yes, there we go. He's in quarantine. He's deciding whether to have dinner in the kitchen or living room or balcony. Yeah, sounds pretty good. I guess you're probably not going to have a gran asado in your living room, but anyway, it's never too early to have a drink with friends. Not the wonderful view of the Pacific this time, but we can manage that. And hi to Sandra in the Alberta office in Mexico City. And Jimena is already drinking. She's trying new artisanal Mexican beers. But well done. Yes, I think we all need to think about ethanol at this particular time of the afternoon. So how have our habits changed? I mean, the obvious thing is that I have not put gas into my car in 2 months. I've had a lot of deliveries to the house. When we have gone to the store, we've often walked, and I have to say that I didn't realize how tired I was from flying all the time. I didn't realize how tired I was from being in airports and on planes, etc. And it's certainly been a cause for reflection on how much time I have lost and how much energy I have spent just through traveling when things could have been done through video calls. I'm sure a lot of people are finding that. But by the same token, it's also clear that we have to be a lot more innovative in the way that we communicate with each other. And one of the things that we've noticed, at the Wilson Center is that, we're getting huge audiences for our events, whereas normally we might get sort of a maximum of 150 people in the room. We're getting, 1,100, 1,200 people on a Zoom call. That's great. But in many ways, it's not the same because you don't have that interpersonal connection in the same way. And so, there's no way that this is going to replace the real thing. But I think we have discovered this is a very useful complement or supplement to it. We've got some questions on the right here, Jeremy.
Yeah, I think, Carlos and I have been trading some WhatsApp messages here, and he's going to compile, it's not the same, but he'll put a few of his thoughts he wanted to share on the discussion, and you and I can look at those. Yeah. Let's grab some of these questions. And I think it's fascinating, about what you said about the filling up your tank and the productivity. And we heard, I thought fascinating, one of my favorite anecdotes about this response to this question from Armando Zamora, the head of the upstream regulator A&H in Colombia, who assumed office literally when the lockdown was starting in Bogota. And he has said he is since going to review and analyze again a enormous office lease and a change and move to new office space and reassess just how much of that physical office space they may want. I mean, I think his point is they have seen a very high level of productivity in what is an extremely intense, area of government and regulatory function. So I think that's a fantastic anecdote. So look, I think people here want to talk about the future politically. I'm seeing a lot of questions. We've referenced the 2021 midterms. We've referenced, sort of what's happening. So let's take some of these. I think you've seen them now. I'll just summarize them in case people can't see the discussion board. Hey, you know what? See, technology does work.
Yeah.
Carlos, you bailed us out. Duncan was just about to say what was going to happen with the plebiscito in 2021. So he doesn't have to answer that now.
Okay. So yeah, sorry for that. Can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Okay.
Carlos de Regules, thank you. Please tell us how we're going to change the conversation, because Duncan and I need to change this conversation quickly.
Okay, so let me just try to go briefly to my main points. So the thing is that, and I'm sorry to break it to you like this, but in terms of energy conversation, there's no energy conversation going on. So there's very little appetite from the Mexican administration to engage in any kind of energy policy conversation. As Pablo mentioned earlier this morning, nobody's listening, and my guess is that nobody will. Pragmatism is not an option today. The capabilities are not there. The will is not there. The rationale is not technical. The rationale is strictly political. So I guess the energy policy debate is now moving into the tribunals, and we will witness in the coming months whether the judiciary is able to play its role in the checks and balances mechanism of the Mexican democracy. I think we do need to keep a proactive attitude, but I also think that we need to bring every single arbitrary decision to the courts, to the legal space. This is unfortunately the place for the time being that the energy policy decisions are going to be debated. But in a more positive note, I think that there is another arena where a different conversation on energy is possible. And that arena is the future, the longer term future. The present, as Monse said also earlier today, the present is full of noise, of beliefs, of loyalties, of fears that make it impossible to hold a decent conversation. But if you move forward and position yourself in the future, you can skip the annoying conversation about the elephants in the room and start moving forward. So I do agree. I think important decisions with important consequences are being made. But guess what? No matter what you and I think, those decisions have been taken and are not going away because they were taken for political and ideological reasons, not for any other reason. So that's not going away. I guess the good news is, like the Persian saying goes, this too shall pass. And when it does, there will still be a country in need of safe, reliable, competitive, and sustainable energy. And my guess is that the conversation on the future of energy in Mexico will entail even bigger challenges that we would have had anticipated. Imagine the possibilities for the next energy ministry. It's going to be really, really interesting. So, and I think what we need to do is address the notion of energy as a pillar of future social well-being, bearing in mind energy's role in responding to questions such as, do people have adequate housing with basic modern utilities? Can people have uninterrupted access to safe drinking and cleaning tap water? Are people living in healthy cities? Can people access ideas and information from anywhere in the world? Is economic competitiveness, creating jobs and fostering the demand for better quality education? Is infrastructure and interconnectedness promoting more inclusion? Is the current energy federal arrangement giving states real capacity to exert their responsibilities? And I think if we are able to frame the energy debate around this whole concept of energy powering social progress, I think there's an opportunity there to visit the future and sort of pass and move on from the current state.
Can I jump in here, Jeremy? I'd like to just sort of make the point. A lot has been written recently in newspaper media outlets around the world about how the pandemic, instead of slowing down the future, in fact, it's been accelerating the future. We've seen the conversation over the move towards renewables in countries like the United States, United Kingdom, for example, that in the first 90 days of this year, we saw that there was more renewable energy being consumed than that coming from coal. That's a huge issue, obviously, in terms of overall climate issues as well as particle pollution. We've seen the acceleration of other trends, for example, moving things online, less moving around ourselves, delivery services, the use of digital platforms in general. And I think that, what we're seeing right here is the opportunity to really take stock of where we are in Mexico and to think about, are we actually seeing the acceleration of the future in Mexico? Because what I see is something quite different. And once again, I think we're seeing that Mexico is an outlier because of the decisions that are being taken in the AMLO administration. There's a golden opportunity right now for policymakers who have been going down a path because that was the path that they were destined to go down. It's an opportunity for them to change the narrative. There's an opportunity for them to say, look, the pandemic happened, there's nothing else that we can do. And yet we see a president in Mexico who is refusing to seize that opportunity. I think it was Jorge Suarez Vela recently who came up with the expression, he never misses an opportunity to miss an opportunity. I think the correct understanding or interpretation of it is that he never misses an opportunity to miss the opportunities that we think he should take, but he does seem to be willing to seize the opportunities that he sees in a situation. And in this case, it's about doubling down. In this case, it's about, seeing this as an opportunity to move back towards a more traditional model than we've seen so far. And just to refer back to the panel that we had earlier on, Carlos, on oil and gas, Rosa Netti, of course, was talking about the future of the refining sector, and Warren was talking about the future of natural gas production in Mexico and the huge potential that's there. But there are great options out there, but we don't seem to be taking them.
No, and if I may jump in, is I think what you're saying about the necessity to change the narrative. In order to change the narrative, you need to change two things: the message, but also the participants in the conversation. And the problem now is that we have been trying to have a conversation with someone that's not willing to listen. But that's not the only stakeholder in this conversation. What about young energy professionals? What about governors that are seeing investments fly away? What about these energy young professionals that are seeing their future jobs fly away as well? What about young voters that will be voting for the first time or the second time in the next years? Also, what about non-political, technical public officials concerned by the current state of things? Or small and medium-sized energy supply entrepreneurs? I think these are all stakeholders of potential stakeholders of a new conversation about the future and what comes forward. And I would say even, why not future elected officials, congresswomen and men, governors, municipal authorities at the national and at the state level. I think we need to think and give more visibility to these unusual stakeholders and perhaps stop trying to talk to a wall.
There's a fascinating point here about this. Who are the stakeholders in trying to expand, the tent and capture more and different stakeholders? And I think as we talk about some of the other countries in the region here, maybe more on the oil and gas side, but some of the things we've seen as part of a community engagement strategy or interaction between government, private sector, and society and citizens is dealing with getting away from the federal government all the control over whether it's royalties, whether it's the taxes paid by the activities, and making sure that those citizens in those areas feel the benefits and not just the distress that comes with some of these infrastructure projects. That's a fundamental change in a place like Mexico. Talked a little bit about that with the gentleman from Peru, royalty reform, more at the department level in Colombia is a huge thing. Just a comment in general terms about how do you get those stakeholders Carlos just talked about engaged, and how do you make sure that every citizen seems to understand this conversation and why they should be part of it, right? So that was my thought there. Duncan, I don't know if you wanted to. We've got a series of questions. I think one of them that's fantastic is about the just transition. And I know when we did our Madrid Energy Conference last year, the Secretary of Energy in Spain spent most of his address talking about the transition, everything that Spain has done to incorporate more renewables. But as part of that message, how they were doing it in a just fashion, right? To manage the energy access, to manage the energy poverty question, and to make sure that it's just not those of us who have fantastic computers and Wi-Fi and bandwidth and this access, but that the average citizen as well is part of this energy transition. So maybe Carlos, where does that fit in? I mean, you talked about the needs of water, for example, and the needs of all citizens to be connected. So, is that the just transition? And how does Mexico make a just transition when right now it seems like, that's not in the cards?
And Carlos, if I could just jump in very quickly, if I can tack on something there, which is that it's become abundantly clear for me, and this hits on one of the other questions on the discussion feed, that grid reliability, stability of supply in the system right now is vitally important. As we're all so connected, we're depending upon these kind of connections to maintain our communication and our professional relations. And even if we're not talking about the professional sphere, about the personal sphere of streaming video services, etc., we've become incredibly, worryingly dependent now on the electricity supply to our homes. And as to echo Jeremy, it's clear that not everybody has the same access, not everybody has the same connection. And so, how does that feed into this overall question?
So yeah, let me take that example. To illustrate how I think about these potential new narratives. The government has used reliability as an excuse really to gain control over the power sector. How about if we were able to turn that around sort of as a boomerang thing, going back at them and then addressing the real reliability issues, which have to do with, is natural gas available, and how often do power plants, the larger power plants from CFE, go out because of unplanned maintenance issues. The third one probably would be the lack of sufficient transmission infrastructure, and a very important one, the cyber threats that the grid is facing. So sort of playing judo with the administration instead of boxing or karate. Okay, let me take your argument and turn it around and see what happens. Let's talk about reliability. Let's really talk about reliability. And I think we need to be more creative on how to do that and redirect the conversations. At the end of the day, I think it's all about this core concept of about the future of energy in Mexico and how energy is a lever to address basic human needs, build the foundations of well-being, and create opportunities. I think that's the bottom line, and I think that's where we should be leading the conversations and engaging with new stakeholders in these conversations. Otherwise, it's going nowhere.
Thanks, Carlos. I think that there's, just to build on something you just said, I think there's a real opportunity if the president is serious in Mexico about having a conversation that isn't just focused on GDP growth, that is focused on human development. This is the perfect opportunity to include this issue. This is the perfect opportunity to say, let's fulfill what the Mexican Constitution supposedly has guaranteed for over 100 years, right? Which is that, there's supposed to be access to electricity, and it can't just be access to electricity for everybody. It has to be reliable access to electricity. Mm-hmm. Let's think about the ways in which we can make that happen, and that there should be a right, at least a right to the opportunity to access all of these services. So I think that there is an opportunity here. But I want to take you up on the point that you made earlier on about talking to different people. I've noticed that it's very difficult around the world to find many examples of leaders, political leaders who have done a good job. Yes, there is the Prime Minister of New Zealand. Yes, there's Angela Merkel. But beyond that, there's not too many that are out there who've done a good job in responding to the pandemic challenge. But I think that there are examples out there in civil society. There are examples in the private sector. And those are the kind of voices that I think we need to bring in. And I know that this can be very touchy, but I do think that there needs to be an international conversation about Mexico, not just a national conversation. And that may be more of a controversial position than many people are willing to accept in this time.
So
go ahead, Carlos.
Yeah, just briefly, I agree that it would be interesting to take the word of the president in terms of trying to define differently social progress and social well-being. Again, I'm not sure that's going to yield any good results, but it's the way to go. I mean, how do you position energy and the energy policy decisions in terms of how does it help in terms of water and sanitation? How does it help in terms of shelter? How does it help in terms of health and wellness? What impact does it have in environmental quality or inclusiveness or access to advanced education? This kind of social progress indexes and measures are somehow backed by energy. Mm-hmm. And that I think would be the direction to take a new conversation. But again, I think we need to engage different stakeholders. Otherwise, the conversation will just stall, I'm afraid.
We've got two great questions here, Jeremy, on the right. One from John Padilla about how do we all work to more broadly educate and help interests in Mexico and the United States understand the energy sector. I mean, that's what you do on a daily basis in many ways. And it's what we've tried to do in different times at the Wilson Center as well. It's an
energy literacy. Energy literacy. It is a very, very difficult thing to do. Absolutely.
But I remember our old friend Milton Costa from Petrobras years ago used to talk about this, and he would say, if you can just show people that that their lifestyles depend upon this, that if they were to open the door of the fridge one day and the light didn't come on, what would they do? That's the sort of the level that we need to bring it down to. I think it's one of the best points that I've ever heard made is that people need to understand where their power, where their energy comes from, and they need to understand that molecules and electrons are completely neutral in terms of their political origins. That we shouldn't even bring that into the conversation.
And I'd go further than that. I'd say, why don't we take John's question to the next level, and is how do you make energy an electoral issue?
How do you?
Yeah.
Is that really what you want to do?
I think we've seen evidence of how it has been used as an electoral issue.
Yeah.
Some may argue wedge issue. That's a term that comes to mind. No, but I think what your point is, Carlos, is how do you use it in a manner that's not just rhetorical, but actually a conversation of the true meaning of the energy literacy, right? So what does it mean for when we talk on these panels about cost-effective energy to drive development in Mexico? What does that really mean? And more importantly, what does it mean to the average citizen? Does it mean the price at the pump? Does it mean their ability to maybe have a couple of extra pesos at the end of the day? I mean, this is the point here that I think a lot of us have discussed and continues to be at the core of this. So how do you indeed put this at the political, in the middle of the political conversation, but not in a way that's a up or down vote on whether Pemex should be state-owned or not state-owned, right? I mean, that's the whole point here. How do you move beyond those sort of legacy taboos, we've called them for a long time?
And that's, I mean, Jimena is commenting on that in the discussion on the right? She's saying, how do we incorporate the social, local, community component to the energy transition? We need to make sure that this is a grassroots movement as much as possible so that it actually makes sense to people.
And I think that's the point here. I saw a tweet from the governor, Cabeza de Vaca, and I think this is to Carlos's point. I think this needs to go down to the state level in Mexico. It needs to go down to even further beyond to the local level in Mexico, where there really are the impacts and where the opportunities and where people will understand this is not a question about 1938, right? This is a question about 2020 and even more so about tomorrow and what my children are going to have in terms of their lifestyle. And so that's the point. I think the one thing I would add is I'm encouraged when we look around and see, for example, here in Baja California, the ability of a state to somehow navigate and disconnect a little bit from the national rhetoric and continue to move forward on a path to incorporating the energy transition. Now, Baja California is in a very unique position that we could talk about, but I would suggest there are some other states in Mexico that have indeed embraced this, what we could call the bottom-up kind of approach to maybe a different conversation.
So I think the opportunity to make this a more evident pressing issue for the population and then transform it into a broader political debate is when it really affects you. So, for example, power reliability in the peninsula or gas reliability, again, in both peninsulas are pretty much isolated. And when the demand comes up again for power, we will start seeing again the lights going out. And that's going to impact real citizens. Another aspect of that is when Tula starts, as Tula continues to burn dirty fuel oil with high concentration of sulfur, all the states in the megalopolis, Hidalgo, Morelos, Puebla, Tlaxcala, and very importantly, Ciudad de Mexico, will be suffering from this. And there will be peaks of pollution, and that I know for a fact in the last administration was one of the main crises that the environmental sector went through. And then, of course, you have the case of Tamaulipas, where investment fleeing the country means jobs fleeing the state. And that's also a thing that could be translated into day-to-day conversations and possibly make it an even more important political issue beyond should we live in 1938 and trust Pemex to save the national economy. No, I think we need to move forward and put future-looking things in the agenda.
Carlos, John Padilla is being incredibly demanding here. He wants to have the second part of the question that he sent answered. So, John, yes, fine, we'll do it because it's you. But the second part of that question actually touches directly on this question of the politicization of energy. He put in here, where are we? How big of an issue will the energy sector be directly and indirectly in the 2021 midterm elections and any referendum on AMLO's presidency? So that's the first thing that I'd like to ask you, Carlos. But there's been a couple of questions on the also on the resilience of the judiciary in Mexico. Leonardo Beltran has put that forward, and Steve Schreiber has written something here. Judicialization seems to be a target of complaint of populists in Latin America, but judges are appointees and viewed as illegitimate by supporters of populists. How do we deal with the legitimacy crisis, and how do energy companies fit in? Do they continue the transition or fall in line with leaders? Pemex under AMLO, PBR some distance from Bolsonaro, and some big oil supports Trump. Okay, so but basically, what's the relationship here? So answer the political thing about the election in 2021. How much you think that's going to feature, and then let's move on to a conversation about the judiciary.
Okay, so just some thoughts on 21. The energy sector is such a mess that there are virtually endless arguments on how it could be better. I think the challenge is translating that into how does that impact you as a citizen that's going to go out and vote in 2021. I think that's the challenge. And in order to tackle that challenge, I think media has a role to play. Think tanks have a role to play. But also I would say political actors have a role to play. I mean, what's the thinking of the mayor, the governor of Mexico City today in terms of the renewable energy policy, and seeing her territory impacted negatively by health issues, and what's going to be in the mind of the next governor of Mexico City? What's going through the mind of the mayor of La Paz when seeing the thermoelectric plant burning fuel oil again? So I think, again, it's a question of messages, but it's also a question of stakeholders. And it's not an easy one, but I think we need to be creative about it and find new ways to engage these people, these unusual suspects, along with these new arguments.
Great. And sort of so on the question of the resilient judiciary, I mean, how do we protect the judiciary? How do we make sure it's independent? What are the other things that we can do? Is it through the political sphere, Carlos? Is it that we need to have greater international oversight? What do we do here?
I think, and incidentally, I think Jimena Marvan was writing something about it. I think, yeah, the external oversight, if I may put it that way, will be very important. So international courts, international trade institutions, we need to have those lights on Mexico. I think the judiciary will feel compelled to do a more robust and independent work if they are aware that there's that an international community is looking. So I think that's going to be crucial as well.
And of course, in the most recent controversy over this with regards to renewable energy, we still have the original NAFTA Chapter 11 in force, and USMCA has its own stipulations on investor-state dispute settlement, as well as state-to-state, which I think we're likely to see at some point as well if the government decides to become more aggressive on this issue. Let's try to apply things back to public health, shall we, Jeremy?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's you talked when I was trying to get Carlos dialed in here at the feed. You were talking about it, and I think it's hugely important. And there was a comment on the board here, so let's pull these together and see how we can talk about public health as a common area to attack this conversation.
I think Carlos was about what do we have here?
Yeah, I think the idea is, we as this conversation, how do you find an area to unite a different conversation, but also, like you said, to pull in different stakeholders. And so, I think one of the most important things, that the esteemed scientist Dr. Mario Molina did was in his analysis of emissions in Mexico City, and just how impactful from, the public health scenario. And that ultimately, of course, was translated into emissions in autos and in manufacturing. And you could argue that perhaps is another way to look at this again today. You alluded to Baja, you alluded to some of the things that are happening in Mexico City. And then to Duncan's point from the very outset of our conversation here today, all of this, of course, is at the moment of a major, major pandemic that is of a respiratory nature and when it comes to health. So is public health the way that we could find new ground and new common purpose?
Well, that's probably a tricky one. You would have expected that in that same sense, environmental protection would have been common ground, and it wasn't. Yeah, I think there's a chance for that in terms that public health is a much more visible thing. I mean, you can actually see it in Mexico City and other parts of the country. So yeah, I think that's an angle. Another angle, less visible but as important as that, I think, would probably be competitiveness. So how is the labor market behaving because of these changes in energy policy? How will it impact future jobs? Is probably another angle to engage in that new conversation.
I think that's a really important point, Carlos, that what we're going to see over the over the next couple of years is a desperate drive on the part of many countries to attract employment, and that's going to come across the board. It's going to come in the form of foreign investment into manufacturing. It's going to come in the form of energy investment, infrastructure investment, etc. But you said it very well when you talked about competitiveness. The fact is that we all know this is a highly competitive environment right now. And so if companies don't feel as though Mexico gives them legal certainty, they're not going to invest there, and they're not going to provide the opportunities for employment for the hundreds of thousands of people that could be employed in that sector. And it takes us back to questions about renewable energy once again. When we think about the job creation from wind and solar over the past few years here in the United States, compared to what we see now in the coal sector, which is such a tiny percentage of overall employment in the economy and employment in the energy sector. So that's where, unfortunately, I think we need to take that conversation. We need to push these points on public health and economic opportunities, and we need to translate them for a broader public, because right now, unfortunately, as is often the case, we seem to be talking to ourselves.
Exactly, and then just probably as a final note is that long-term scenario planning can be a very compelling tool to communicate these issues. If we are able to describe a future where renewable energy is playing its role, where the supply chain of this new energy industry is producing jobs, well-paid jobs, where it's fostering higher education and higher quality education in the country. If we're able to vision that future and communicate it in a compelling way, I think that can engage these different stakeholders that we need in that conversation, the young voters, the young energy professionals, and all the rest that I mentioned before.
I think it's, the beauty of so many of these conversations we have every year at La Jolla is they continue, right? And they build upon one another. And I think we are making progress. obviously in the conversation today about Mexico, I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that we've taken, if not steps sideways, steps backwards, and we're dealing with a situation now that is challenging in a word. So my point here is that we will continue our efforts, whether it be energy literacy, whether it be these dialogues virtually, in person. And I do believe everything Carlos is saying, and we hope to move beyond everyone who's here today. I mean, there is a bit of that preaching to the choir. And I think that's a good way a challenge to take away for all of us. How do we continue to get more people, get people on this event, get people on other events that have not been part of these conversations before. Mm-hmm. And I think to Duncan's point about the virtual conferences and the virtual events, we do have an opportunity. We have a way to get those people who maybe weren't going to travel or were not sure if they wanted to go to something to hopefully dial in. I hope this week we've brought people online who've never even heard of the La Jolla Conference before. And so hopefully we've had a little bit of a piece in which you've alluded to, Carlos, and nicely spelled out. So let's keep changing the conversation. Let's keep improving energy literacy. Let's keep working towards a better world. Let's not be too Pollyannish, but we'll deal with what we're dealing with. Let me make sure that we get our relatively fun final poll in here. Duncan, I don't know if you had any thoughts here. This one is a bit of a setup. It's the final poll. So here we go. Ready? Is everyone voting? I know you may be tired of voting, but this one's a fun one. Let's check it out here. Well, let me ask you first, Duncan, because you really do probably miss something from Mexico. You're living in Washington, D.C. You said it's rainy, probably chilly. What do you miss most about Mexico? The museums, the beaches, tacos al pastor, culture, or how'd this one get in there? How'd this last one get in there? Competent and reasonable government? What do you think, Duncan?
That one, Jeremy. I'm going to do that. No, it's funny. When I, because I haven't been able to travel to Mexico for more than 2 months, first of all, I missed the jacarandas, which was a great show. Then I missed tacos al pastor to the extent that I made my own. I even made a little trompo. It was like, it wasn't as good, but it was pretty good. And honestly, right now, and this is going to sound totally cursi, but I miss Mexicans. I miss my abrazos y besos. And I don't know whether they're coming back anytime soon. I hope they are. But so it's a funny thing. I can't wait to get back to Mexico when the time comes.
Carlos, you're in Mexico, but nevertheless, which of these items do you miss?
I'd have to go with competent and reasonable government. Sorry for that, guys, but it's a source of frustration every day to me. So yeah, and absolutely, that's my number one.
It's a bit of like I said, this was a bit of a setup here to end the La Jolla Conference with, I don't know, but certainly 44% of the people agree. There are lots of folks who are coming in strong on the tacos al pastor. I guess if you live in Washington, D.C., Duncan may be able to deliver some for you in the coming days, long weekend.
Service here in D.C. There we go.
There you go. Tacos al pastor estilo Duncan, Aztec Dunky. We're out of time. We're at the end here. This has been an amazing wrap up to an amazing week. I'm moderately biased, of course. Thank you, Duncan Wood. Thank you, the Mexico Institute at the Wilson Center for co-hosting today and helping us out here. Carlos de Regules at Deloitte. We're looking forward to engaging with you in your new capacity at Deloitte Latin America and our colleagues there. We had a great session in Mexico City at your fantastic offices and just by the Angel there, and look forward to some more breakout sessions like we did there on energy transition, I should note, and social engagement, social license to operate. Thank you all. Again, the team at the Institute of the Americas, all of our sponsors, everyone who's had anything to do with this delivery of an amazing conference this week. It has been an absolute pleasure to deliver this, bring this to you via the interwebs, via the World Wide Web and other remote accessing. Thank you again. And look, we hope to get back in person. We'll all be in touch. We'll continue our virtual programming. And I think we'll see how we do this next year in some kind of hybrid. I think it's very realistic to think about a hybrid model of in-person and virtual event that continues to, like I said, incorporate more and more people who otherwise couldn't have joined us. So that's all I've got.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Congratulations, man.
Thank you, Jeremy. Great job.
See everybody next year.
Hasta pronto.